Here we go. Cool, we're running. Hi everyone, I'm Max McKenna. We're here in the Harold Washington Library in downtown Chicago. I'm joined by David, Matt, Shefali, and Bob, myself here. We're going to be doing a close reading of Still Life Portrait by Pierre Reverdy, translated by Kenneth Rexroth. Still Life Portrait. Cigarette papers, date book, and tobacco pouch. Life ought to be like a painting. Still. And literature? A hairless head. Eyes straight. Comma, a flat nose, a plane on the forehead. My portrait. My heart beats. It's an alarm clock. In the mirror at full length. My head smokes. That's Still Life Portrait. Any first impressions on this?
You know, I was just reading something by Louise Gluck, in which she talks about art, some art becoming artifact and some art not becoming artifact, the difference between a painting and literature. But it seems like here, it's almost like the author is painting a painting. He's making an artifact. He wants you to picture all these various objects in the still life portrait that he's painting here, and that it seems to me he's saying approach this poem as if you would approach a painting with all these objects in it, and let that poem affect you the same way the painting would if you were looking at a painting with cigarette papers and other things lying around.
That's very nicely said. I agree with that. I really love the way that the first line and the last line encompass the poem. He's talking about the cigarette papers, and then his head is smoke at the end. And it really is such a nice top to bottom portrait.
Yeah,
you could say.
No, that's really good.
There's also something very sort of distinctive with the first line as well, just the way, you know, he names three things: cigarette papers, date book, and tobacco pouch, but there are no commas. And so
Could be fourth.
Oh, sure. But the date book especially is kind of out of place between the first and last lines. You have the cigarette papers and the tobacco pouch. So you're starting to think about the date book, what kind of relation does that have to the other things that he's kind of sort of listing. And I think that carries on just as he starts to, he's refusing to separate out what the artist does or what the writer does from the scene and the experience that he's trying to describe. What is a date book?
A date book?
Yeah. Is it just a...
It's like your agenda, I think, your little calendar.
Calendar.
I imagine a small calendar, leather bound, with some of his meetings and
Pocket secretary of the movie.
I thought it was interesting.
At least in the old days, they used
I thought it was interesting that there was like no punctuation. So like I found myself like going in and like adding like colons and trying to see like what is being referred to what, like whereas like ought to be like a painting, so it's life ought to be like a painting. And like a literature should be like a hairless head. So I was trying to go back and trying to see like what are those descriptors referring to. But then it was odd that he puts in like a comma there, like so he adds the word when it would be great if he had like put it in, so we can like follow it along. But I do like some of like the art kind of references. So like a flat nose, a plane, like that made me think of like cubism, like being like, or like there's the Picasso painting where like the women that in the painting they're all like flat, so they're not like representational, they're not 3D, they're on a plane. And then also like the one where it's in the mirror on full length. That reminds me also of like, I think it's a work by like Rene, like Magritte, where it's like he takes the human body, but he like chops it up. So like one
Mhm.
part's the head, one part's like the torso, and like, but it's like, it's full length.
Sure.
So it's like he's taking it, he's like cutting it up, but then he's putting it all back together, so it is like that full person. So that was a lot of interesting kind of nods and references.
That's good to follow the cubistic aspect of this poem. I think is very important. I think we see this in some other modernist poems that try to use painting techniques, specifically cubism, and recreate those. I think we have this breaking down of the body, and then kind of reconstitutes itself at the end in that full length. But not quite. My head smokes. Yeah, thanks for pointing to that, Matt. I love that image, and it's very, for me, that's like a classic Magritte image. You can imagine Magritte. Oh, I can just imagine.
Yeah.
You know, you gave it to Magritte, so yeah.
I think there was an exhibition on him like last year.
There's a painting in the Art Institute, I think it's a Picasso, called The Smoking Man, a man with a pipe, where you know, you have the pipe here and the head here, and you have all these different objects which would be in a regular painting of a man with a pipe, but they're all
separated. That's
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's cool. Yeah, that's very cubistic.
There seems to be also a pushing against the idea that you can portray someone as a still life.
Yes.
Especially with that, my heart beats.
Yeah.
Is my portrait
Very
that
good.
my heart beats. I am living. I'm not something on a plane, something you can
Sure.
describe in words. My heart beats. It's an alarm clock. So there's a pushing against that still life as well.
I would say there's a bit of a pushing and a pulling, really,
Mhm.
because there's a constant tension, and I think that's encapsulated in the title, Still Life Portrait, right? Like myself as still life. Can anybody say anything about what still lives typically look like, or what they are?
Usually fruits,
Yes.
vegetables,
Yeah.
foods.
Objects, usually domestic.
Are they ever people? No.
No.
Still life is I think it's defined by the fact that it's not people, it's not portraiture, it's always objects, it's always, as you said, domestic objects.
And then,
Fruits.
all the fruit.
Right.
Yeah.
and then typically the goal in like still life would be to make it like as like representational as you can.
Yeah.
And I think that he's doing like basically the exact opposite, where you're not taking like the literal kind of meaning. You are kind of turning that on its head.
I just, I want to go back to just what Matt was saying a moment ago. How does, because that moment, I think you're right, my heart beats is something living and dynamic that you can't capture on the surface of the painting. How does that fit with that claim just in the, if we can read it all together, life ought to be like a painting?
Well, I don't know that I'd read it, life ought to be like painting.
Yeah.
I view this as a list poem, and each line should be, we should take each line as it is, not as an exam. I'm not reading it as an exam line in any way. So,
So what do you do with the line ought to be like a painting? What do you do? And then the implied connection with and literature, you want to be like painting and literature.
Lifestyle, yeah.
I would tend to agree that it is a list. It's very much a list poem, except in that moment, I really think it invites you, and the absence of punctuation in particular really invites you to work with those enjambments. I think before you get to a hairless head, there's a few different ways that you can read that. So you start with that list of objects that we had, right? And then it goes right to life, ought to be like painting, still, and literature. Like, there's so many ways that it could be. Life, so you could read it like, you just read it like life, that's one thing. Ought to be like painting, that's another line way, it's autonomous. But or be life ought to be like painting, it could be colon still, right? That life ought to be still. Or it could be life ought to be like painting still, period. Like it should, you know, life should still be like painting. I wish life was like painting again. Or it could be life ought to be like painting still and literature. You know, life ought to be like both of these things. Or it could be when I read that, I read it in such a way that literature was like hairless head, right? That was the part because that's also invited too. I think life ought to be like painting, and literature ought to be like a hairless head, which is very surrealist image, right? Yeah, I don't know what to do with that. But that one in particular, I think there's so many ways it's very confounding.
I'm going back to the title now.
Sure.
We have, it's not a still life portrait, it's a life portrait,
Right.
a still life
Still
portrait.
life portrait. Yeah.
And so,
Same kind of thing. It's kind of a confusing
well,
mixture of things.
exactly, a life portrait.
You know, when he, towards the end there, when he says, my heart beats, it's an alarm clock, you would think that the second line would sound better if he said, my heart beats, it's like a ticking clock, but he doesn't say it. You know, he's not concentrating on the tick, 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 but he's saying it's an alarm clock, it's something that wakes me up. It's something that, the fact that I'm alive, unlike all these other things that I'm making, that my heart sort of alerts me to the fact that I'm not part of this painting, as you pointed out. Still, what it's something incomplete. It's not alive.
Sure, yeah. What would it be? So, yeah, working with that.
The alarm clock thing is what it seems to be almost out of place there.
Right, so we had mentioned this sort of persisting liveliness or vitality, but how, or now you had said the kind of pushing against the stillness, right? Like wanting to, some kind of vitality persisting. However, I think, Bob, you're right to point out the alarm clock is an interesting term there, the metaphor.
I think it ties back to like the beginning with the cigarette papers, the date book, and the tobacco pouch. It's like these kind of like everyday type objects. So, like an alarm clock, obviously you use it every day. It's kind of like a part of the routine. But then, like the way that it's phrased here with the heart beating, it's almost like he's giving life to it. So, I just thought that was interesting. That, like again, like going back with like the movement, trying to utilize kind of everyday objects in like a new way. So I thought that's kind of what he was doing here with the clock.
Again, I'm not reading any commas or enjambments, so I'm not reading my heart beats. It's an alarm clock. It's an alarm clock being my heart. I'm just thinking, I'm viewing them as completely disparate images altogether. And so it's an alarm clock, I think, is going back to
The list of objects.
the entire portrait, sort of the portrait itself, one of the pieces of the portrait. And not being tied in specifically to the heart. That's how I read it. Who's the other, is this poet in Modpo that did his life that day, 13 things I did that day? Is that
Oh,
a
yeah.
poem? It's sort of a list poem where he talks, I got up, I went for a run, smoked a pot.
New York School, right?
Is that in Modpo?
Yeah, it is in my
Okay, so if it's not, I didn't want to bring it up, but.
Sorry,
But that's another.
sorry everyone. I can't remember his name.
But that's it's sort of, it reminds me very much of that
Yeah.
poem in the sense that you do try to make all the things connect. I think it's titled 13 Things I Did That Day.
Yeah.
You can only, depending on how you read the lines, you could
Right.
come up with 12 things or
Right,
14,
exactly.
but you really couldn't come up with 13. 13.
Right.
Is that in Montauk?
That is in Montauk.
Okay.
That's I'm pretty sure that's in New York School Week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this poem just reminds me very much of that.
I mean, I think it might just be worth thinking about the genres that are being evoked in the title. So the still life, we already sort of talked a little bit about that. And the portrait, they have, I mean, things get just new principles and new terms come into play, like, you know, in the 20th century especially. But conventionally, there are sort of aspects and elements and principles of composition that come to play within a still life that are not usually the same when we come to the portrait. So the title itself is suggesting that a kind of doing away with like formal conventions and the boundaries between sort of, you know, different kind of like areas and questions of like representation. How your representation, how we represent life. You know, the still life, you know, when you were asking earlier, I was trying to think, like sometimes like animals,
Right.
and sort of, you know, fowls sort of fit into like old still lives, but they're dead, they're hung up, and they're there just for like, you know, exhibition purposes. But the portrait, pre-20th century, trying to be representative of the person,
Right.
having a lot of kind of like social currency, cultural prestige aligned with it. But 20th century, just like the whole modernist experiment, trying to explode the kind of representational possibilities. So something here, thinking of the poem itself as a formal composition about the meeting and the problematic of like different sort of principles coming together, trying to make them work, and because it still is like offering a poetic form. I don't know where else I can take it.
No, that's very good, and I actually, let's run with that for a second. Your observation about genre and the challenge that's being posed to genre in this poem, and about the challenges being posed to representation. I really like what you said. It got me thinking what you said about portraits prior to the 20th century. Not only were they trying to capture the likeness of the person that was being painted, but also something about their social milieu, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you would have, you know, if you were wealthy, you would have your portrait painted with your, I don't know, your
jewelry,
your jewelry, your
Fancy
telescope,
vase,
or whatever, you know, stuff like that. You know?
Oh, I should have had I forgot. I left my telescope in my
Right.
You had it on the table.
Your like brassy telescope. I don't know why telescope is the first thing in mind. But yeah, that's sort of a mark of the social setting. And even if you were, say, bourgeois, if you were middle class and, you know, not upper class, and you're still having your portrait painted, you would still have some sort of objects of, like, significant objects, right? So there's something going on here by having, as we were saying earlier, these objects are so mundane and so everyday to the point that two of them are literally about, like, marking the day. The alarm clock and the day book, they're literally about the day to day. And you have these completely mundane objects that, like, don't quite fit in a still life, right? Which, if you think of the longer, you know, centuries-long tradition of the still life, as you were saying, David, you know, sometimes there's dead fowl or something, or you have some abundance of flowers or grapes or, you know, a chalice of wine or whatever. I mean, you have all of these not always luxurious objects, but definitely not. You know, if you walked into a room, so if you think of like a classic style, I'm trying to think of a still life, there's a few over at the Art Institute. If you try to imagine like this kind of like ornate still life, if you walked into that room, you'd be like, oh wow, this is a hell of a room. Like, you know, it's not. You rarely do a still life of just like a corner or something. It's usually something elaborate. But if you walked into this guy into Reverdy's room and there's just like his alarm clock and his cigarette papers and his date book, and this is just this guy's life. There's nothing fancy here. So on one hand, it's a weird set of objects for a still life, and also a strange set of objects for a portrait, right? Like if he commissioned to have his portrait done, and the only thing he can think to include in that portrait is just the little things he has in his pockets. It's very strange. It's very much going against it's very much going against his conventions, I think, David, as you were saying. So I think this really means to converge this still life and the portrait genres, and also like kind of explode both at the same time by making a point about well, I would say it's a point about objects and people. And I'm going to say that very broadly. He's making a point about people and objects. That there's something going on here. There's this kind of cubistic rendering of the self, this almost detachment from the self, this objectification of the self. Right, the flat nose, the nose of the comma being the nose, and also this vitality, the heart beating, the head smoking that wants to go against that. You have both of these things happening at the same time, and it has something to do also with these very quotidian objects of the cigarettes, the daybook, the alarm clock. That do with that observation what you will.
It's not concerned also with like traditional, like what you would want to achieve in a portrait, which would be, the blood likeness, that you catch the light, that would be like something of importance, like if you were to look at a Singer Sargent painting, but this is like not concerned with any of those like traditional, like artistic kind of measurements. Instead, it's, a nose on the forehead. It's completely distorted. So again, not how you would usually measure like a good portrait.
Sure. No, that's true.
Yeah, I think it's the mixture of the two that stands out to me. When as you've pointed out a couple times, that traditionally a still life is a bowl of fruit on the table or something, flowers, and a portrait of life, a portrait of a person is a bit more grandiose and a bit more uplifting, or at least the person who's getting his portrait painted wants it to be uplifting and special. And you're putting those two together, I think. It's not a still life, it's a still life portrait.
Yeah.
It's like putting the two together, and if you took a still life and you had humans in it, or you had life, if you took a real life in it, this is what it would be.
Sure.
I think, didn't you point that out before, man? That putting together those two things is, I think, what he's trying to accomplish.
It reminds
Something
me,
you can't really do in a painting,
right?
which you
That's
can't,
a good
which you
point.
can you can't make an artifact look like that, but you can do something like this and make the person's imagination, the reader's imagination, create that.
And it reminds me of that O'Hara poem where he visits his friend, the painter, Mike,
Why I'm Not
and
a
he's
Painter.
painting
Why I'm Not a
sardines
Painter.
and.
We'll encounter that one too in New York School. It's true, yeah. There are definitely, there's definitely some resemblance there. I mean, just thinking about painting and literature, and the descriptive powers of each, and something interesting to think about when we do encounter O'Hara, and we have a little bit of context. I mean, it's very likely O'Hara read this poem in 1956 or something, right? I mean, not only is very likely, it's probably a certainty.
He had the book in his pocket.
He had that book in his pocket. There's no way he didn't read this poem. Unless he skipped over for some reason.
Plus, it was a curator at the
Which is
Museum of Modern Art, so.
This whole idea is kind of lingering with him, even though O'Hara's not he's not like a surrealist, Dadaist quite in the same way. at all. I mean, he has some he takes some ideas of surrealism, like the walking around, I would say. That was a Bretonian surrealist idea. But he's, O'Hara's, his head's not smoking. It's like Rene Magritte style, like Nightmare.
Yeah. That line, like my heart, it just reminds me of like Edgar Allan Poe, I guess. But I guess everybody is probably inspired by what has come before, so it wouldn't be surprising either if, oh wait, this is later, so, but I mean, maybe it's the other way, that, like, Poe could have been, or,
No, this comes after.
this comes after, so then,
This is after Poe, and the
Right.
French love Poe.
right, so then they could have been probably inspired. It reminds me a little bit of Poe, that some of those type of, like, horroristic kind of images where, like, my heart beats is, and it's the fact that it's in its own line, just kind of reminds me of that.
How are you reading that? Is it my heart beats or my heart beats?
Ooh.
I want to add in, like, there's not a whole lot of verbs, like, that are going on in this poem.
Mhm.
So, like I want to read it as a verb, so, like, my heart beats. But in going with the rest of the poem, it could make sense, like, my heart beats, like as in almost like a noun. Like describing the portrait, where I mean, it could be read either way, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about the form in general. I think we talked a lot about the content. We already mentioned a little. Well, obviously these questions have come up. Something we've mentioned the punctuation, or rather the lack of punctuation, the enjambment or the lack thereof, the listiness of this. The way he seems to be kind of listing his, listing these characteristics of himself in this detached way where nothing is quite adding up, except maybe at the end, or where he sees himself full length in the mirror. Any other observations on form here? What the form is doing? It's unique.
Just when you say the word characteristics, and I was just thinking of the status of the things that are in the poem, because some of them, and most of them I think are things that we can objectify and we can imagine just in a painting. So you have the cigarette papers, the date book, the tobacco pouch, head, eyes, nose, clock, mirror, subject of eye, head. These are all things that we can see and sort of recognize. And there are a few that are a little bit more general. So life, painting, which can go both ways. Painting can be a painting, but also just like the act of painting.
Yes, very good. Yeah.
Literature can do the same kind of work, but usually we use that in the general sense. The plane, the portrait is another word like the painting that goes both ways. It can be like a very particular portrait, but it also can be the genre. So there's some kind of, and even I was also just thinking about the status of what was happening in the first few lines, because that first line seems to give us things, papers, date book, pouch, but then we move to life, and there's kind of like, are we meant to think that somehow we can leap from these things to thinking about life with a capital L? And then we move to just like speculation, ought to be like painting speculation or imperatives, or it seems like just the form in a very kind of tacit kind of way is suggesting that the way we look and perceive, the kind of things we do in making portraits and still lifes and such, we seem to think that there's something larger like invested there, and it kind of leads us to think. So it seems to be just the form is suggesting the kind of movement that happens when we look on and reflect on like the subject of our poems. Like,
No, that's good. I like that the intrusion of that big picture reflection on life. It does feel very sudden after that list, and I almost want to read it like he's got this still life, like he's looking at his desk. He's like, all right, I got cigarette papers, daybook, and tobacco pouch. All right, that's an easy painting. Boom. He's like, what if life was what if life was that easy? What if it was just this enumeration of objects? Like life ought to be like this. And so he turns to the mirror and he says, okay, hair was dead, eyes straight, comma from my nose. I read the comma as the nose, but I don't know if that's right. A flat nose, a plane on the forehead. There, my portrait. So he does the portrait like he would the still life. He says, what if life was like painting, right? I'm not entirely convinced of this reading. I'm just kind of floating this out there. But then there's that end where suddenly there's a little bit of like life or agency returns, right? The heart beats, the head smokes. He's full length again. It's tricky.
And commas, I guess that's the most unusual of them all, a comma.
Yeah. And it's also the thing that's lacking, right? I mean, this, as far as punctuation goes, comma's the one that's really
Could use. And he's given it to us.
He's given us
just in a different
one in the
way.
middle.
Like you
Well,
want a comma, like here's a comma.
Right.
is a comma when you just spell it out?
When you spell it, that's a good question. I don't know. Turning that comma, into the word. I don't know. It's strange. But I think the stillness, it really is.
Yeah, I mean the comma thing is funny because it's taking it into the realm of dictation, where normally people who dictate would dictate the comma,
Right.
and so it has a part in the language that's speaking it and identifying a technical way like that.
Right,
It kind of
It's as if you were exactly, eyes straight, comma, nose flat.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing.
so it's reminding us that sometimes just again the marks on the page, they have a life beyond the page, or I don't know.
No, that's very good. Yeah, I like this idea of dictation. The marks on the page having a life beyond the page, and I think it really takes us. That kind of idea. I mean, it's what's adding up for me here with this poem is that he really wants to dwell in this middle space between something that's alive, dynamic, and something that's dead, object. Like he really wants to dwell. He doesn't want to say one or the other. He just wants to see what it's like to be in that middle space. How much can an object be like a person, and how much can a person be like an object? And so something like a poem. How much can a poem be like a painting? How much can it be? Right. I mean, that seems to be what he said. And how much can speech be like a poem? With a word like comma, for example. How much of this is a description of himself, or I mean, as we were saying a second ago, I was reminded of maybe it's because of the poem we read earlier, but I was reminded of a description of a.
Okay. No, she said we could. The librarian, because the air conditioning is cold in here.
I don't know what